Hello everyone. So today we'll be talking about a very important psychological construct, which is that of memory. Now, when we talk about memory, we talk about three different kinds of processes which are involved with the memory. The first of these is something that we call encoding, right? This is basically when you're trying to get something inside the memory, right? So you're trying to build a code or build a memory code so that you can store whatever information that you want to store inside memory, right? The second process that we look at is that of storage, right? And this is where we consider something like sensory storage, short-term memory, long-term memory, right? And we look at some of the distinctions between these distinct kinds of memory storages. And last but not the least, we look at retrieval, right? This is basically getting something out of memory. So whereas in encoding, we look at getting something inside memory, in retrieval, what we're doing is we're trying to access a memory, right? Bring it out from the storage, right? To the surface of consciousness, we can say, right? But what we're trying to do is that we're trying to access a memory. We're trying to get it out of storage, right? So that it's easily accessible to us, right? So these are three of the functions that we studied in the context of memory. And these are broadly what we look at in the context of this chapter, right? So first of all, let's start with encoding. So when we talk about encoding, we say that encoding involves forming a memory code. There's a diagram in your book which sort of lays out the same sort of distinction that we've drawn out here. I can show you that as well. So you have the diagram here. The good thing about this diagram is that it's looking at all of these different processes that I've laid out here as well, but it also draws an analogy of these processes to an information processing by a computer. So here you have encoding, which is again forming a memory code. Here, the analogy that they draw for that is that you're entering data through the keyboard. When you have something like storage, which involves maintaining encoded information in memory over time, the analogy that is provided here is saving data in file on hard disk, right? And for retrieval, when you have recovering information from memory stores, the analogy to that is you calling up file and displaying data on the monitor. So this is a helpful analogy in the sense that it helps you think about all of these different processes that are involved, with memory. And it gives you a useful picture when you want to sort of think about all of these different processes, right? So yes, so let's get back to talking about encoding, right? So encoding involves forming a particular memory code. Now, there might be different factors that are related to how successful your encoding is, because sometimes what you might experience, so for example, let's suppose I gave you a lecture to study on intelligence, right? Now, you might not have, if I ask you everything that was included in that lecture, you might not be able to remember. So why might that be? Right? One of the reasons could be that, one of the reasons of forgetting involves ineffective coding. ineffective encoding, right? Which basically means that there was failure during the stage of forming a memory code. Now, what could be reasons for that? Now, one of the reasons is very simply that of the role of attention, right? Very simply, if you do not pay attention while listening to a lecture, you will not be able to form a memory code, right? And if the memory code was never formed, there will actually never be any forgetting because, if something never made to storage, then if something never made it to storage, then it's not possible for that to be forgotten. So this is not a failure in retrieval, rather it is a failure in forming a memory code. It is a failure when we talk about encoding. Hence, going back to what we were talking about, the role of attention is extremely important. And when we talk about the role of attention and how it operates, researchers vary in terms of what their research tells them about how attention works. So let me show you a useful diagram here. So when you look at this diagram here, what it basically shows you is that there is a stimulus, right? When stimulus is there might be sensory detection. So for example, when we look at the example of sound, let's suppose, right? So, with sound, you might have sensory detection in the sense that you might sense that there is some kind of sound coming, right? Now, some researchers say that the filter of attention is really here, right? This is when you start attending to the phenomena, right? Whereas other researchers say that the next step here, which is the recognition of meaning, that, when you start giving this sensory detection meaning, जब आप फॉर एग्जाम्पल कोई भी साउंड आती है और आप समझते हैं कि ये साउंड कह क्या रही है या इसका मतलब क्या है so that is basically the recognition of meaning here, which is the next step, right? So other researchers, what they do is that they place a filter here and they say that, attention begins to play a part at this stage after there has been the recognition of meaning, right? So basically, the models that place the filter of attention here, basically what they say is that you start attending to a phenomena just as there is sensory direction. This is where you start paying attention to the phenomena, right? And these are called early selection models. Because essentially, attention, what it is it is like a funnel, right? In the sense that you have so many different stimuli in the environment that you can attend to, right? But you choose to attend to, only some of the stimuli that are in your immediate environment, right? So it acts as a funnel because you select certain stimuli. Question is that where does that selection happen? And this is what this model is trying to address. Stimuli, are they selected for attention while there is sensory detection? They selected for attention after there has been recognition of meaning. Now, where you stand in terms of these two positions, if you believe that attention starts playing a role, it starts acting as a funnel as there is sensory detection, then you believe that you side with the early selection models here, right? Whereas if you believe that attention starts to play a part after the recognition of meaning, then you side with the late selection models that are here. Your book talks about this example that if you are at a party and you're having this very intense conversation with your friend and there's a lot of noise, right? So obviously you're filtering all of that noise out, right? And you need to do that in order to have this conversation with your friend, right? But someone says your name, right? And you immediately attend to your name being spoken, even if it is, at the other corner of the room. And you immediately know that, it's you recognize that your name has been called out, right? Now, what sort of selection model does that provide evidence for? If we go back to this model, that this phenomena seems to provide evidence for the late selection model, that you recognize that this person is calling out your name, and this is where the attention filter comes in, right? So this is what basically, this diagram is trying to show you. I hope that you guys understand what I've tried to lay out here, that, different researchers believe that the location of the attention filter is different. Certain researchers believe that it is here when a sensory detection has taken place. Other researchers believe that it happens after some sort of meaning has been attached to the sensory stimuli that are presenting themselves to the senses. Some other researchers believe that the position of this filter is much more flexible, so it can move between these two positions, right? And that's more of the current way of thinking about it. Right. Now, so when we talk about moving on now, when we talk about encoding, one of the first things that we should ask is if encoding is so essential to our remembering information, because obviously it forms, it involves forming a memory code, then how can we enhance coding? Now, what we see is that the way in which we encode has an influence on how well we are able to remember, right? So, one of the first things when we talk about enrichment of encoding is levels of processing. Now, what exactly does that mean? When we talk about levels of processing, right, we'll basically look at three different kinds of levels. Let me show you a diagram. Now, basically, we have here three different kinds of encoding, right? So the first of these is structural encoding, right? The second of these is phonemic encoding, and the third is semantic encoding. And what you see here is that this goes from basically shallow processing to deeper levels of processing as you move towards the semantic encoding. Now, what exactly are these three different layers or types of encoding? Right now, here we have the structural encoding, which says that, the structural encoding emphasizes the physical structure of the stimulus. For example, let's suppose you have a particular stimulus here, right? Let's suppose it's written like this, right? So structural encoding will look at what sort of font is this stimulus written with, right? What color is the stimulus, right? How large is it? Is it written in capital letters? This is what structural encoding will involve itself with, right? We say that structural encoding, which emphasizes on how this word is written, what color it's written in, is it written in capital letters? This is the shallowest form of processing, and it basically is not, it's basically not very good for remembering or encoding. Now, more intermediate levels of processing include phonemic encoding, which basically emphasizes what a word sounds like. So that would involve that you look at this word here and you think about what does it sound like? Does it rhyme with the word bat, right? What sort of voice is it, said in? So all of these things will involve phonemic encoding because they emphasize what a word sounds like, right? And this is basically an intermediate level of processing here, right? Deeper levels of processing involve something like semantic encoding. So if you see the word cat here, you try to understand what it means, right? So, you try to think, what exactly is a cat, right? Does this word fit into a sentence? The dash chased after the mouse, right? So this is basically what it is, and what you see is that semantic encoding is the deepest level of processing that you have, and this is the level of processing that really guarantees the most retrieval, and this is something that I show you next. So if you look at this diagram, what you see is that, on the x-axis, you have the depth of processing. So you're moving from structural encoding to semantic encoding, and you're looking at the y-axis on the number of words that are recognized, right? So you're following a recognition kind of, memory test here. What exactly that is, we'll get to later in the chapter as well. But basically, here you're looking at how successfully you're able to retrieve, right? And what you see is that the retrieval rate for semantic encoding is the highest because this is the retrieval rate right here. For phonemic encoding, it is lesser than semantic encoding, but it is still higher than structural encoding, right? So what you see here is that for semantic encoding, the retrieval rate is the highest, right? So one of the ways in which you can enrich encoding is then if you try to understand what the meaning is of the material that you're trying to remember, right? What other ways can you enrich encoding? So, one of the ways is through, the levels of processing. That's something we've considered. Right? What other ways might there be? So another such way is that of imagery, right? Visual imagery. So if, for example, you know, if I give you a word and I ask you to imagine a picture with it, then that will make you remember that word better, right? Now, that also depends because, certain words, when you are talking about words, certain words are high imagery words, right? Whereas certain other words are low imagery words. So, for example, if I give you a word such as cat, right? Or if I give you a word such as banana, right? That might be a high imagery word. Or I give you a word such as egg, right? So that also might be a high imagery word because you can imagine what an egg looks like, right? However, if I give you a low imagery word, which might be a word such as justice, right? Or truth. Now, because these are more abstract words, these, you might not have a lot of imagery associated with them, or it might be difficult for you to imagine a particular image with them. And, therefore, these words might be more difficult to remember, right? Because they have less imagery involved. And this is, again, this is what we see in this diagram as well, that for high imagery words, the amount of recall is the highest, right, as compared to words that are low in imagery, right? So, visual imagery really helps with encoding, right? What could be some of the other factors that are involved in enriching encoding? What do you guys think? Another factor that is involved in enriching encoding is self-referent encoding, which basically is that you draw a reference to yourself while you're looking at any kind of information. So let's suppose you're hearing a story, right? And you wonder how this story relates to you, right? So that will help you remember this story better, right? Or if, for example, you come across a particular concept in a Psych 100 course and you think about how it relates to you, if it reminds you of something that's happened in your own life. So then that is an example of self-referent coding, that you're sort of linking it with yourself. And this is another thing that you find that, doing that, sort of referencing it to the self helps you encode better. And then as a result, remember better as well, right? So these are some of the ways in which you may enrich encoding, right? With this, we sort of end our discussion on encoding and we move on to our next topic, which is storage, right? So when we talk about storage, we basically talk about three different kinds of storage, right? And it's not that there are, physical structures of the brain that correspond to, the different kinds of storage that we're going to talk about. This is basically a model of memory that we have. Now, what you see here is what is referred to as the Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory. And what you see here is when you talk about storage, you have three different kinds of memory, right? You have sensory memory here, which basically is, you have sensory input and you have sensory memory. What basically that means is, sensory memory basically, what it does is that it preserves, it preserves sensory information in its original form, right? But for a very, very short period of time, for something like a fraction of a second. That is, what the duration of sensory memory looks like. What you see is, in this picture, you see a boy using a sparkler, right? And I'm sure that some of you have seen these here as well. They're known as pool jharis. And what you do is that as move this around in the air, right? What you see is you can see its trace for a very brief period of time, right? So this is basically what sensory memory is like. So this is a good analogy for sensory memory in the sense that it just preserves the trace of sensory information, but for a very, very short period of time, right? So this is basically what sensory memory is when we talk about it here, right? Next, what we talk about is short-term memory, right? And here we have that, then through the role of attention, right? So the filter is here. What happens is that, whatever stimulus there is, right, moves to the short-term memory storage, right? What exactly is the short-term memory storage? This is something that we look at. Now, the way that short-term memory is defined is that it is, again, storage that has limited capacity. And this is something that we come to in terms of what is capacity, right? But also, a place where you can store information, right, which is unrehearsed, right? So you can store unrehearsed information for about a duration of 20 seconds, right? But if you keep on rehearsing the information, right, which is the rehearsal loop right here, then you can keep it in there for longer, right? And that is why, if, for example, you're taking down a phone number, let's suppose, so what you do is that you need to remember that phone number, you keep rehearsing it, you keep repeating it to yourself. So if you keep rehearsing that information, then it's possible for you to keep it in short-term memory for longer than 20 seconds, but otherwise you would lose that memory within 20 seconds. The fact that you can hold objects in short-term memory through rehearsal also shows you how basically the short-term memory depends upon phonemic encoding, right? Next, what we talk about is the limited capacity of short-term memory. What we see when we talk about the storage capacity of short-term memory is what is considered plus minus 7. You know, 7 is considered the magical number, right? So basically what you believe is that in short-term memory you can only hold, between 5, 7, or 9 items. That is what plus minus 7 means. 7 plus minus 2, sorry. So basically you say 7 plus minus 2, right? That is basically what it means, that it's either 5, 7, or 9, right? So these are the amount of items that can be held in memory, short-term memory at any given time. And if you have more items than these in short-term memory, then some will be lost, right? Some researchers believe that the capacity is even lesser than this, that it's actually something like 4 items that you can hold in short-term memory at any given point. But one thing that you can do in order to increase the capacity of short-term memory is that you can cluster different objects together. So let me show you an example of this. I ask you to memorize these different letters. So, they are FB, INB, CCI, AIBM, right? Now, these are much more than, our magical number 7, right? So in short-term memory, it would be difficult to hold them. But if we cluster them, right, then it will become easier. So for example, if we make a meaningful cluster out of them, so, for example, if I cluster them such that I say FBI, NBC, which is a news channel, I believe, right, CIA, right, and then the last would be IBM, which is a computer company, right? Now these becomes chunks which are, these are basically 4 chunks, right? And then this is then one item, whereas here this was one item, right? And this was another item, and therefore the items were, more than 7. But here FBI becomes one item, NBC becomes one item, CIA becomes one item, and IBM becomes one item. And therefore it will be easier for you to remember this more than this, right? So in this way, if you form clusters, it would be much more easier for you to keep this information in your short-term memory because of the limited capacity, storage capacity of short-term memory, right? Now, short-term memory has also been conceptualized as working memory by certain researchers, right? And there is a particular model of working memory that has been put forth. Let me show you that model. This is what this model looks like. And the first component of the model is the phonological loop, right? Which is basically, here, whatever is maintained in the phonological loop is maintained through rehearsal. So this is the component which is at play when you're trying to remember a phone number. Sorry about that. Through rehearsal. So when you're, for example, constantly saying, when you before dialing the number, you're saying, oh, okay, so it's 0332 470, whatever the number might be, right? But this is the component of working memory that is at play when you're trying to remember a phone number through repetition, through rehearsal, constant rehearsal, right? Then the second component here, which is called the visuospatial sketchpad, is the component basically which allows you, right, to, for example, allows you to hold and manipulate images. Now, let me give you an example of this. So, for example, let's suppose you want to rearrange the furniture in your room, right? Now, in order for you to do that, right, you have to stop and sort of imagine that if I move the bed here, how will it look? If I move the shelves in this, towards this wall, what will this look like? If I move the carpet here, what will it look like? So it basically involves you sort of pausing and trying to move all of this furniture around in your head, right? So this is enabled by the visuospatial sketchpad, which is allowing you to hold and manipulate images inside your head, right? And this is happening within working memory, right? So this is the role of the visuospatial sketchpad, right? Then you have the central executive, right? And what the central executive does is that it basically decides on how much attention, for example, you will be giving to what task, right? It also decides, it also coordinates between all of the other components of working memory as well, right? So the central executive is what is at play when you're, for example, trying to multitask, when you're trying to watch TV and hold a conversation with someone at the same time. So basically, the central executive modulates not just attention, but also coordinates between all the other components which are involved in working memory. Last but not the least, what the episodic buffer does is that it forms a connection between working memory and long-term memory, right? So it serves as a buffer between, what will travel to long-term memory. So yes, this is what working memory is about.